Thank you, Avi. Good morning, afternoon, good evening, friends, wherever you're dialing in from. Thanks for joining us today, and Avi, thanks for the opportunity to share this work with the rest of the group. What I'll do, as Avi said, it's part of a master's dissertation that I finished last year. And so what I want to do over the next 35 or so minutes is to just give a quick background on the research itself, some definitions and some select concepts around inclusion. And then I'll share some of the data with you, the rationale, the barriers, the elements that contribute towards fostering inclusion, and then some of my recommendations. And then we'll open it up for a Q&A time. So just to give you an idea of the background, my name, as you have heard, is Reinhold Titus. I'm from Namibia. And interestingly enough, I find myself in Germany right now, working with OM ships, OM International Ships head office here in Germany. And I'm responsible for the strategy of the ministry and also the inclusion piece of the ministry, sitting on the leadership team. I grew up in Namibia for most of my life. My dad is South African. And so for 2 years of my primary school years, I lived in South Africa. My parents are from two different ethnic backgrounds as well as national backgrounds. And of course, just growing up during the time of apartheid has greatly influenced my perspective on the work I do and insights. So I want to put this out there. When it comes to this particular piece of work, I've been involved in global missions for probably about 20 years now. And this is a piece of work that has come on, been in my mind for probably the last decade or so. I was on the verge of walking away from, the traditional mission agencies, and just through various ways that the Lord challenged me to do this piece of research. So I started the MA about 5 years ago, doing it part-time. And when I started this MA, I was in the UK at Radcliffe College for summer school. And I happened to sit down with a lady from Latin America. And so we were talking about our studies, and she asked me whether I knew what I wanted to research as part of my MA. And I said to her, yes, I knew. I felt God had put something specific in my heart. And so she asked me what it was. So I explained this research to her that I wanted to do. And I spoke for about 2.5 minutes or so. And at the end of that, I just had this blank expression on her face, coming back from her face. And I thought, okay, maybe what I explained didn't make sense to her. So I asked her, did this make sense? And her response caught me by surprise. Her response to me was, I want to cry. That's what she said. And I asked her, why are you saying that? She says, Reinhold, I'm serving in an organization that you've just described in Latin America. I'm on the verge of leaving this organization, and I've never been able to put in words why I want to leave. You have just given the words to why I feel the way I do. I can tell you, conversation after conversation, even after my research, whenever I speak, people coming up or who've read the dissertation just saying to me, you've just told my story. And so what I was trying to do is really to look at this concept of inclusion. I've got a background in diversity and inclusion, cultural intelligence in the corporate space, and wanted to look at it in what I call Western-founded global mission organizations. So organizations that was founded in the West and now operating globally. And of course, when you do a master's research, you need to focus. And so what I did is, by the grace of God, I found 11 African leaders who were either the CEOs or international directors of such an organization, or one of the associate international directors. And so engage with them on this research. So just some of the research questions that I've been looking at is, to what extent has global diversity and inclusion been given attention in Western-founded global mission organizations? And then I tried to understand what progress has been made, because most organizations have made strides over the last, however long they existed, but particularly over the last 10 or 15 years. So I wanted to try and understand what progress has been made, what has enabled that progress, and so forth. But also to understand what are some of the barriers towards inclusion in these organizations and how they're grappling with that. And then lastly, just how further inclusion can be fostered. So those were the research questions, and I had several interview questions that I unpack. And as I just engaged even with the literature, this was part of what I found, that when we look at the diversity and inclusion literature, from a sociological perspective, there's a rich body of work. But once we get to a biblical perspective on this, there's a much smaller body of work. And then when you talk about in the missions context, even less work that we've done missiologically on this. And then, of course, listening particularly to majority world voices, there's really very little in that space. And that's why I wanted to focus the research. So just for those of you who are into research, just the framework that shaped this, and particularly the methods at the end. I did semi-structured interviews with 11 leaders serving in 8 different organizations, average about 90 minutes each one. Autoethnography, which was really an incredibly helpful method that I discovered as I did my studies, just to use my own experience to reflect. And then, of course, the participant observation research. I've been serving in these organizations, been involved in various kinds of roles, and so just observing as I participated in this. In terms of just framing this, when we talk about inclusion, it happens at multiple spheres or levels. There's the individual piece. So the whole sense of how we understand ourselves, the sense of identity, who am I, what has shaped me, etc. And then there's the interpersonal, that inclusion is fostered by how we treat one another in whatever space we find. So that interpersonal behavior. And then there's the group and teams level. So the practices, the norms, and the collective experiences of inclusion in whatever teams or groups we find ourselves. And I always encourage people that as I engage in this work, I think the Lord has really challenged me that this does not just relate to the mission organization or whatever space academic institution that I find myself, but I think about everybody that I interact with. I think about all kinds of teams. So whether it be a cell group in church, what does this look like? Whether it be in a family context with my family, what does it look like? So really all of life. And then there's the leadership and leaders piece, and I will say a little bit more about that. But that is sort of called the linchpin for inclusion in organizations. It's leadership and how leaders enact this. And then there's the organizational piece, and that's where I've sort of focused this work, is the macro organizational piece. But there's also the societal piece, where inclusion, the policies, the practices. And I think this is important because even as we engage in a global conversation around this, we all come from a particular paradigm. So the national context in which we find ourselves and whatever gets discussed around this topic, we bring that with us into this organization. And I often say that as somebody also carrying a South African passport, it's fascinating, especially to engage with South Africans and Americans on this topic because of the history and what's happening in that context and the filters that we bring. So all of us bring that into the space. So, and we are influenced by all of those factors, and equally so. We can influence all of those factors. So just to be aware of it. But as I said, I focus on the organizational piece. Just a few quick definitions just to frame the conversation. Firstly, it's just around diversity. And diversity purely refers to difference, whether it be national, gender, how we think, etc. It is just difference, visible and invisible differences that we have. However, when it comes to inclusion, that's a different matter. And often we use these two terms interchangeably. But inclusion, particularly in an organizational context, is about an environment that acknowledges, welcomes, and accept different approaches, styles, perspectives, and experiences to allow all to reach their potential and result in organizational success. So it contributes to whatever the mission of the organization is. But it's about what happens in that environment. Are we welcoming it? Do we accept? Do we embrace it? And then it requires taken for granted ways of organizational assumptions and other barriers that organizations and societies create exclusion. So we take this for granted, but there are these invisible barriers that often creates exclusion rather than inclusion. And so we need to become aware of that on an organizational level. Paying attention to the strengths. Most organizations have certain strengths. What is already happening in the organization and how do we leverage it. But ultimately, it's really about paying attention to the structures and the cultures, the policies and the practices, the skills and styles of leadership, and even the day-to-day interaction amongst people. So all of that further enhances inclusion within organizations. Within the literature, it is accepted. There is no one globally accepted definition for inclusion. And so organizations work this out and ascribe a meaning for them in their context, because organizations are so different. And so just really to give a snapshot of just select differences between diversity and inclusion, which I think is important, is that diversity focuses on the makeup of an organization. So just the diversity that we have, whereas inclusion focuses on the extent of meaningful participation of all people in the organization. So how deeply and meaningfully are everybody engaging in the organization? Diversity is a fact of life in most work groups and organizations, but inclusion is grounded in what we do with that diversity. When we appreciate and value people because of, not despite of their differences and similarities. So it's what we do with that diversity. And then diversity can be mandated. We can tell you need to have so many people from so many backgrounds on your team, but inclusion is a voluntary act, whether we actually allow it to happen in our organizations. And then often diversity focuses on increased recruitment of minorities, whatever those minorities might be. But inclusion is about removing barriers to enable high performance from everybody in the organization. And that's why being aware of the barriers is so important. This is just one quote, and I will skip some of these quotes that I have, but I think Whitman wrote this in 2006 already. And he talked about mission organizations, and he says, our mission organizations have been shaped by North American culture, worldview, and values, as well as theological assumptions. The problem is that we have often been unconscious of the strong impact that our culture has in shaping our beliefs, our strategies, the way we do business, and organize our institutions. So again, there's a rich body of literature that acknowledges that the culture in which organizations begin shapes the DNA of those organizations. Just another concept that, of course, we hear a lot when we listen and read this work is the whole issue of equity. And I think this is important as well, that there's a difference between equality and equity. When we focus on equality, then the emphasis is on giving everybody the same, regardless of their need. But equity acknowledges that people have different starting points, and they're given what they need in order to succeed in the same space. And, just from a biblical perspective, it's fascinating to read 1 Corinthians 12 through those lenses, when he talks about the image of the body of Christ and those who were honored and others who were not honored. And so that is important. And then just the last concept that I want to share that I think is vitally important as well as we have this conversation is around, when we talk about inclusion, we often talked about belonging, and that's an important aspect of it. But there's also an aspect called uniqueness. And I found the work of Shaw and other academics particularly helpful in this area. So when we talk about belonging, it's really the human need for close interpersonal relationships. And that is fostered through the opportunities for influence that people have in an organization, the opportunities to influence decision-making, opportunities for access to information, resources, and networks. So people feel a sense of belonging when those things are present. But on the other hand, and this is the paradox of inclusion, the importance of uniqueness. And so uniqueness is the need to maintain a distinctive and differentiated sense of self. So the acknowledgement that I am different and that we are different as we occupy the same spaces. They came up with this framework that I've slightly edited that I think helps. So they talk about the need for belonging along a continuum from low belongingness to high belongingness. And then they talk about the value for uniqueness in an organization from a low value for uniqueness and a high value for uniqueness. And so when you have a low value for belonging and a low value in uniqueness in an organization, then what happens is individuals or particular groups, they're not treated as an organizational insider with unique value in the work group, but there are other members who are insiders in the group. So that is when there's exclusion. We may be physically in the same space or on this same organization, but we clearly know that there are organizational insiders and there are those who are not. That's exclusion. If we foster high belonging, but still a low value for uniqueness, what happens is assimilation. So individuals and groups are then treated as an insider in the work group or organization when they conform to the dominant organizational cultural norms and downplay their uniqueness. So then they just assimilate, you sort of ignore the uniqueness, you leave that at the door as you come into the space and you assimilate into the dominant culture or norms. When there's a high value for uniqueness, but a low level value for belonging, then individuals or groups are not treated as insiders in the group, but their unique characteristics are seen as a valuable and required resource for organizational success. So people get co-opted into organizations because they can give a different perspective, but they never quite belong in this organization. There's never that sense of, I am now part of the insiders of this organization. So that's when there's differentiation. And it's incredible when people, when I do training with leaders and I unpack this just to hear stories of how people see themselves in this different quadrant. And then there's inclusion, when individuals or groups are treated as insiders, but they're also encouraged to retain their uniqueness within their work group. So I belong, but not because I assimilate or I conform, but because my uniqueness and the characteristics that I bring as somebody who's different is appreciated and valued. So just a couple of reflections. So as I asked participants in the research how they define inclusion in their space, these were some of the comments that came back from these leaders. They talk about belonging, and they define belonging as a space where everyone feels equally welcomed. And where you see the quotes, it's direct quotations from the research. And valued for who they are, what they contribute. And then they talk about being family, enjoying koinonia, that deep sense of fellowship. And being at home, being part of the family because you belong. And then one leader went on and said, I've been around organizations and even sometimes my own organization where you almost feel like an outsider. The other issue they raised was the issue of representation as a prerequisite for inclusion. And they talk about representation of people from different demographics, and not just within the organization, but on your senior leadership levels, whether it be board or executive, that we need to see the diversity of the organization represented in those spaces. But they were also very careful, and they said, they talked about voice, and they said representation, whether on leadership teams or board level, does not equal transformation. It comes down to, do you have a voice? Do you have a voice in that space? And then when I asked about, what do you mean with voice? They talk about issues like decision-making. When people are involved in decision-making throughout the whole organizational life process, so from the planning, the organizing, the implementing process, phases, and not just involving people when it comes to implementation, but then there's a group of insiders who actually does the planning and organizing and determine the agenda. And so they talk about the need for access. I asked them access to what? They said access to decision-making, access to power. And this was a critical issue that came up again and again, the issue of power. Access to resources, while another one said aspects of all leadership within the organization. So those were some concepts that came out of that. So when I probed and wanted to understand why they felt this was important for organizations to pay attention to, basically 4 reasons that people responded to. One was the biblical imperative, missiological, strategic, and personal. And so just briefly, what they meant by that is, this was a beautiful part of the whole experience for me as well, is when they talk about inclusion, it really starts with who God is, not for the business case or whatever, but who God is. And so the whole sense of the Trinity, 3 persons, distinct, yet one. And so that the Trinity is really at the heart of the biblical understanding of diversity and inclusion. So they talked about that, Jesus, the Father, I'm in the Father, and the Father in me, and the Holy Spirit. And then they talk, and there's the work around the creation. If you look at Genesis 1, God created heaven and earth. God created the birds of the sky, the creatures in the ocean, created day and night, seeming opposites, yet meant to function together as one. So creation is an expression of God's diversity and yet inclusiveness. And then they talk about the body of Christ and that picture in 1 Corinthians 12. The nations, Acts 17, where it says that from one man God created all of these nations. And then, of course, there's a beautiful picture that we are so familiar with in Revelation 7, that there will be a people from every tribe, every tongue, every nation, dressed in white robes who will stand before the Lamb. If diversity wasn't important to God, why did the Bible not just say there will be people dressed in white robes? But actually it acknowledges the diversity of the tribes, the nations, the languages. And so this is, again, a positive affirmation of God's intent with diversity. Often it seems like diversity has become a problem, but that was not God's intent. That is part of the fall and sin. And so there is no culture, no gender, no generational group that can say they are perfect. We are all fallen, and so we need to acknowledge that. Of course, from a Christian point of view, we need to critique the concept and what does this mean for us? And there's often the concern about, does it mean all things goes? And a lot of debates in different circles around this. And I think, again, Miroslav Volf's work around exclusion and embrace has been very helpful. And he says that there needs to be boundaries. The absence of boundaries doesn't mean inclusion. It means the end of life. And so generally within organizations, there are already certain boundaries. Like the vision and mission statement of an organization defines what the organization is all about. And therefore, if I want to be part of that, the question is, do I buy into that? Our statement of faith, our values, statement values and so forth are part of the boundaries. I think the challenge with boundaries is often the boundaries that we have within organizations that defines who's in and who's out were created in an era by a group of people who did what they could at the time. But now, as we are people from many, many different backgrounds, the question is, are those boundaries still the boundaries that should be in place? And I think that needs to be humility and courage within organizations to re-examine the boundaries that we've set that often determines who's in and who's out. But so there's the rich body of work around just the biblical or emerging body of work around the biblical aspect. I mentioned the missiological part of it, and we all know that just the growth of the church in the majority world, the issue of women came up in the research, and how do we respond to that in terms of inclusion to women. The generational aspect, I think one of our brothers did a presentation a few months ago around this generational issue. The country in which I currently live, Germany, the average age is about 45 years, the average age of the population in Germany. In a country like Kenya, it's 20 years. What does this mean for us missiologically? And then they talk about the strategic importance of this particular topic. So again, even if an organization just looks at its mission or its vision statement, what they want to or we want to accomplish, and you look at that and you say, can we really do that without taking this issue seriously? Can we do that? And then, when we take it seriously, we attract more diverse people because people see themselves belong, they see their voices being heard, they feel they can be part and they can contribute to this organization. So attraction of bigger talent, there's greater trust, there are new perspectives and innovation because we learn from one another. And so it contributes towards that. Retention, the reality is so many people today stand in the doorway of organizations. And they're looking at how organizations are responding to this, whether we're embracing this, and that will say to them, yes, I want to be part of this. But I listen to so many people who actually at the point of saying, if organizations don't take this seriously, I'm out. And so even when we look at retention of people and how we retain people and improve performance because of the perspectives that we have. So it is of strategic importance. And then we can talk about just personally, you and I know, as we engage with one another from diverse backgrounds, how much that has helped us to grow as people. So let me just, some of the barriers that came up in the research towards around inclusion, what are those? And I'm just giving you some bullet points in the Q&A. I'm happy to unpack some of these more, but these were some of the barriers that came up. So there's the whole issue around superiority. And again, there's a rich body of work in the literature around this. But the sense that some people in the organizations, because of where they come from, have the sense of superiority. And just the fact that organizations were founded in the West often sets themselves up as in terms of who leads in these organizations, because they are shaped for a particular group of people from a particular context. So the issue of superiority came up as a key issue that we need to look at. And in fact, it was the dominant issue that came up. We can look at some of the reasons behind it around colonialism and all of that, and some of the work more recently around whiteness and so forth. So there's superiority, and then there's a point around inferiority as well, where some of the leaders would say that for such a long time, particularly Africans have heard this mantra of Africa is to be helped, Africa is a dark continent, Africa is to be pitied, Africa is to be educated and developed. And then one leader said, sometimes we believe those things, and it took me a while to overcome that. I found the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o quite helpful when he talks about decolonizing the mind. And he talks about how colonization is actually one of the most powerful things it did was the mental universe of the colonized. And so the whole issue of inferiority that often becomes a barrier. They talk about silencing of voice, partly because people from diverse backgrounds are not there when decisions are made. Or if they are there, they keep quiet because they don't feel safe to do so. And so they talk about that. They talk about money and mission models. And again, money came up as a dominant issue around one of the barriers towards inclusion within organizations. So where money is raised, who owns money, who makes decisions around how it's spent, paternalism, dependency, all of those issues are part of those barriers that we're talking about. Then they talk about a lack of understanding and intentionality. And one brother talked about the fact that we've not really sat around the scriptures and unpacked what does this mean for the body of Christ globally, and what it means to actually foster inclusion. So there's a lack of understanding, but also a lack of intentionality, that people can pay lip service to this. But one person says, it is one thing to express your intentions for change. It is another to make change happen. So the intentionality to actually do this. And then the issue of leadership and decision-making. And let me just read a quote here. There's an assumption of spiritual leadership as only coming from the West, or when it is exhibited in a Western context, dressed in a Western garb, with Western cues, dynamics, and styles. But spiritual leadership from another context is considered to be the one that doesn't meet the standard or the threshold. So how we understand leadership and involvement of people in decision-making was seen as a barrier. And then the issue of insecurity and fear, the binary mindset that, okay, if we talk about inclusion and including certain groups of people, then it means I'm out. And the fear that comes with that as a barrier towards inclusion. So those are some of those. And then just when we talk about what helps to foster inclusion within organizations, these were some of the vital elements that contributed towards the progress, but also that leaders feel needs to be attended to. And not surprisingly, the first one is leadership. And they are very clear about it. They say that if leaders don't pay attention to this, if leaders don't make this happen, it's going to end up nowhere. And so leadership was a key aspect of it. And what was encouraging is when I asked them about the progress that has been made, some of the progress is because majority world leaders have been insisting for change in organizations. But every here and there, actually the change has been driven by Western leaders in certain organizations where they have advocated for it, where they have stood up. In fact, just last year, I got to do work with one of the organizations, and the person who leads the organization is a German, and he's the biggest advocate for this in the organization. So again, the importance of leaders taking responsibility and leading this work. And so some of them actually have appointed somebody on the executive team to focus on this, or they put groups together within the organization to focus on that. They talk about collective spiritual discernment. And so just praying together, searching God's word together, listening to one another. What is it that God would want us to do with regards to this issue in missions today? They talk about an enabling environment that is welcoming, an environment that invites those voices, and so forth. They talk about an awareness about what does this mean and how do we do that. And then they talk about, just the supporting structures, systems, and processes that needs to be in place for this to happen. So the management level of it, because the danger is that this can remain just a conversation, but it doesn't get embedded within organizations. And so they talk about managers with a global mindset, managers that actually helps this in terms of HR and finances and all different aspects of organizational life. What does this look like, and how do we embed that in our structures, systems, policies, and so forth? And then the importance of measuring what we're doing. How do we know we've made progress? And so most organizations are measuring the diversity element of it, but don't quite know how to measure the inclusion element. But the recognition that this is vitally important. So that's some of the elements that contributed. And so just lastly, in terms of recommendations that I came up with in the research, it was an incredible gift for me to listen to these leaders and to engage with work, Harvey's work, some of you who are on this call's work that I've read and cited, engage with leaders from around the world. Just an incredible privilege. And I realized the wisdom that already is within the body of Christ. And so what I proposed was that we need to have conversations around this issue. And again, if you read the literature, there's a Brazilian author that released a piece of work last year, Nascimento, where she also talks about this issue, and she just appeals for the need for a global conversation around this. Graham Hills, in his book, Global Church, have talked about it. So many have talked about this issue. So I'll just talk about the biblical rationale for conversations around inclusion, just the paradigm change around organizational change, from the Newtonian approaches to organizational change to conversational approaches. And then conversation and culture. When you look at many of our cultures, particularly from the majority world, the importance of conversations to actually foster change within our societies. But the reality is, so often when we gather, we may be in the room together, and some of these thorny issues comes up. And somehow we're not able to have the conversations in the room. But when we walk out of the room and we are in the passages, or we are in our affinity groups, then we talk about these things. And often those are the very things that needs to be talked about in the room if we're really to make progress and change within the organizations. So why is it that we're not able to have these frank, honest, generative conversations in our organizations? And I think, just again, looking at this, is there needs to be certain conditions in place for us to have these conversations. And so conditions around organizational commitment. People are tired. They say, if we're just going to talk about this and we're not going to change, leave me out of this. And so are we committed to change within organizations if we embark on this journey? Grace and forgiveness, we've seen this with the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and in other places of the world. It's not been perfect. But if we're to have these conversations, there need to be place for grace. There need to be place for forgiveness, because mistakes have been made and will be made. And so somehow as the people of God, as much as we experience that grace and forgiveness on a daily basis, if we're going to do this work in a healthy way, we need to have this as part of our process. And then talk about safety and courage. And this is the paradox. How do we create psychological safety within our organizations? And that is the work of the organization. But then at the same time, the courage as well. Because sometimes spaces are not safe. And that's one of the lessons that Esther teaches us. If I perish, I perish. But if she did not speak up, her people would have perished. And also particularly those of us who've been in these spaces for a long time, do we have the courage to raise these issues and trust God that we can deal with it? And so that paradox of safety, but also courage. And then just issues of power. We cannot ignore power when we get together in these rooms. We cannot ignore issues around equity and inequity. We cannot ignore the issues about the boundaries that's being set and who sets these boundaries. And then inclusive participation. So these are just some of the conditions that I think is critical if we are really to have conversations that foster greater inclusion in organizations. And then just, the issue of leadership is vital as well. How do we foster leadership? There needs to be representation when we do this work. But one of the pieces of work that I did is I engaged with a Western leader. I gave him a copy of the research before I submitted it. And then we had a moderated conversation around this research with my supervisor. And at the end of our conversation, this comes up as, just as he pays attention to where he's at on this journey. And he talks about leaders and he says, leaders are at 5 different levels in this journey. One is where leaders don't know and they don't care about this. Or 2, they know about this issue, but they don't care. So knowledge is limited, so the need for concern is not elevated. And then he talks about P3, where leaders know and care, but they're not ready to take that step. So the courage and the conviction gap is too big. We know about it, but we don't have the courage to act. And then he talks about leaders knowing and caring, but don't know how. And then lastly, where leaders know, care, they're ready and they're equipped to actually do this work in organizations. And then he says this about himself. He says, most of my leadership life has been P2, where I knew but didn't care. And he says, I am not alone. How do we identify where leaders are at and take them on the journey? What is needed to get somebody from, example, P2 to P3? Where do we focus on our effort? And then just as I finish off, a last quote from one of the participants that I thought was incredibly powerful. And so this is the last piece in the dissertation. So this is what one of the participants of the research said. He says, I know it is hard. None of this that I have talked to you about, I do not consider it to be an easy thing to fix, to achieve. And I know it is very, very hard. But the one thing that causes me to press on is that I know that whether in my generation or not, whether in my time or season of leadership or not, as long as we pursue these things, they are deeply theologically and missiologically grounded. Therefore, they warrant being pursued. We need to pursue them, whatever happens. And that's what really keeps me going. If I were just to look at the difficulties or the hard work and all of that is involved, it would be easy to be discouraged. But because I'm convinced of the theological and historical value, and even the strategic value of it, I just say to myself, it is the way to go. Thanks, Avi. I'll stop there.